She stayed. Not with any announcement, not with any ceremony. Yoon So-yeon simply started being present. She fixed the leak in old Bori's cook-fire flue with a hairline seam of frost that somehow made the metal stronger instead of weaker. She taught Nabi how to spot a rift-touched puddle before it froze someone's boots to the ground. She never once let Do-hyun add her to the citizen ledger. "I'm not registering," she told him the third time he tried. "Registering means I'm here on record. On record means findable." Findable by who? She didn't answer that. Do-hyun, who had spent 3 weeks learning that the fastest way to lose a citizen's trust was to push where they'd drawn a line, let it go and privately started a second ledger, off the books, that listed exactly one name under a column he labeled, with his usual flair for bone-dry paperwork humor, "Unregistered Consultant, Frost-Related Services." She saw the ledger once, over his shoulder, and didn't ask him to change it. That was as close to a thank you as he was going to get, and he took it. The story of a 0-rated steward who'd fed off a hunter-rated collection squad. The version circulating by now credited him with the ice too, which he found both flattering and mildly terrifying, did more for the yard's population in 5 days than 3 weeks of honest labor had managed on its own. People came from zones 4, 7, and 9, dragging what little they owned, because word had reached them of a district where the ration pool was shared. The notice board told the truth, and the man in charge apparently filed monsters as a paperwork inconvenience. System. Population. 51 registered citizens. Tier 1 threshold reached. Old. Tier 0. Ruin. Basic ordinances only. No formal charter recognition. New. Tier 1. Settlement. Charter office unlocked. Independent trade rights. Resource survey unlocked. Public works tier cap raised. Why it matters. Ashfall is no longer a reclamation zone that hasn't collapsed yet. It's a settlement the city charter is legally obligated to acknowledge. Which means, for the first time, Verrow's merchants can trade with it directly, no middlemen skimming a cut on the way in or out. Do-hyun read the notification standing in the middle of what used to be a garbage heap, and was now, against every reasonable expectation, a district with a functioning gate, 3 working wells, and a population that had grown by 29 people in less than a week. He said out loud, mostly to himself, mostly delighted. "We get an office. You get a folding table and a very official-looking stamp," Han corrected, already sketching a floor plan on the back of a supply manifest. "But I'll take it." The charter office turned out to be exactly that. A folding table, a stamp Do-hyun carved himself out of scrap rubber with more enthusiasm than skill, and a legal designation that, on paper, let Ashfall negotiate trade terms as a recognized municipal entity, instead of begging city merchants for scraps at slum prices. Mira drew up trade maps to the 2 nearest desperate zones within a day. Within 3, Ashfall had its first honest trade agreement. Scrap and sorted salvage going out, medicine and seed stock coming in. Brokered not through threats or desperation, but through a district that could finally, legally, put its name on a contract. It was, Do-hyun thought, possibly the most boring superpower in the history of superpowers. It was also working better than anything Draven's cleaver had managed to stop. The resource survey tab was new, and it did something none of the others had. It asked him to actually walk the territory, tile by tile, mapping what sat beneath the ground he'd claimed, not just what stood on top of it. Nobody had ever surveyed the Ashfall Yard properly. Why would they? It was a garbage dump. Garbage dumps don't get surveyed, they get ignored. Which was, in retrospect, the whole point. "There's a sub-basement," Han reported 3 days into the digging, wiping soot off his face with a hand that was shaking slightly. "Under the east heap, old rail tunnel, looks pre-fracture. And Do-hyun, you need to see this yourself." The tunnel had been sealed by a collapse decades before anyone currently living in the yard had been born, and it took Bori's crew the better part of a day to clear enough debris to squeeze through. What waited on the other side made Mira drop her lantern. Lightning, faintly luminous, humming at a frequency Do-hyun felt more than heard. The same low resonance he'd started noticing at the edge of his territory sense whenever he stood too close to the east heap, which he'd assumed, until this exact moment, was just his own nerves. System: resource deposit detected. Aetherite vein. Unstable. Rift adjacent. Estimated value: extremely high. Warning: extraction without proper containment risks rift bleed. Feral spawn probability: elevated. That's not garbage under our garbage, Han said quietly, staring at the glow. That's a fortune. A dangerous one, but a fortune. Do-hyun stood in the tunnel a long moment, running the numbers in his head, and arrived at a conclusion that made his stomach turn over. Nobody accidentally forgets to survey a deposit like this, he said slowly. Somebody knew. Somebody looked at this exact spot, decided it was too dangerous or too inconvenient to develop properly, and instead of sealing it off and posting a warning like a reasonable city would, they turned it into a reclamation zone. Seo-yeon finished from the tunnel mouth, arms crossed, expression unreadable, and dumped everyone the city didn't want directly on top of it. Nobody said anything for a moment. Above them, faint and distant, one of the perimeter alarm bells started to ring. The ferals started coming up 2 nights later. Small, scattered, nothing like the slaghound, more like the vein itself had noticed being disturbed and was leaking its irritation up through every crack in the tunnel ceiling. Rat-sized things with too many joints. A swarm of what looked like glass-winged moths that dissolved anything organic they touched. Nothing Draven tier. Everything relentless. Jian and Biscuit caught the first wave before it reached the surface. The second wave, 3 nights later, was bigger. We can't fight this every night, Han said, exhausted, at the war table that used to be a supply crate. Not and still run trade, still build, still feed everyone. Something's got to give. Do-hyun looked at the tunnel map Mira had drawn, at the pulsing vein snaking beneath half the district, and felt the shape of a solution assemble itself the way it always did for him. Not as a weapon, but as a system. What if we stop treating the leak like a threat, he said slowly, and start treating it like a utility? Han blinked. You want to contain an unstable rift vein. I want to channel it, Do-hyun said. Every mining operation that's ever worked a dangerous vein does it with containment lattice and pressure venting. We don't have mining engineers. We have you, and a woman who can freeze a hunter's arm solid from 30 feet without trying. So-yeon, leaning against the tunnel entrance, raised an eyebrow. You want me to freeze a rift vein. I want you to seal it, in careful, controlled sections, while Han builds proper venting between each seal so the pressure has somewhere to go besides straight up through our floors. Slow bleed instead of a flood. We turn a liability into a power source instead of trying to pretend it isn't there. It took 9 days, working nights around the trade caravans and the daily grind of a district that refused to stop growing, even while half its workforce was underground. So-yeon's ice, layered with a precision that told Do-hyun more about her old rank than any tattoo ever could, sealed section after section of vein wall into stable containment. Han's venting turned what should have been a monster factory into something closer to a well. System: Aetherite containment. Stabilized. New ordnance unlocked. Ether well. Passive development point generation, plus 12 per day, permanently increasing with territory tier. Feral spawn probability, reduced to negligible. Achievement unlocked. Hazard converted to asset. Do-hyun stood at the mouth of the tunnel on the 9th night, watching the faint blue glow pulse steady and calm instead of erratic and hungry, and felt, for the first time since assessment day, Something that wasn't relief or exhaustion, but honest, uncomplicated pride. Old power, he murmured to So-hyun, who'd come to stand beside him without either of them quite deciding to. Was a district sitting on a problem nobody could afford to solve. New power is a district that turned the problem into the thing funding everything else it needs. You talk like a man who's already planning what to do with the extra income, she said. I am absolutely a man already planning what to do with the extra income. She almost smiled. It was the closest thing to one he'd seen from her yet. They sat there a while, in the quiet, before she finally spoke again. Not the guarded, clipped So-hyun of the past week, but something closer to the person underneath. Frostspire doesn't send its S-rank candidates on garbage missions, she said, not looking at him. I was supposed to be tower-bound within the year. Then a retrieval mission went wrong. A rift breach, nobody flagged in time. 4 hunters dead, and someone with a lot more political weight than me needed a name to put on the report that wasn't theirs. They blamed you. They ruined me, she said, quiet and precise, the way she did everything. Stripped my rank, buried my name, made sure every tower in the region would recognize this mark, a brief touch at her collar, as a washout instead of what I actually am. I've spent a year deciding whether I want revenge or just distance. She glanced sideways at him. I still haven't decided. Do-hyun didn't offer sympathy he didn't think she wanted, and he didn't offer advice on a decision that wasn't his to make. He just nodded, once, and said the only honest thing he had. Whichever you decide, you don't have to decide it broke and starving in an alley. There's a ledger line with your name on it whenever you're ready to be found. She didn't answer that either. But she stayed until the tunnel glow burned down to its steady, contained hum, and when she finally left, for whatever corner of the yard she'd claimed as her own, it wasn't with the same careful distance she'd kept since the night of the raid. 12 miles away, the broker's morning had started with a very different kind of glow. A resonance spike, faint but unmistakable, logged automatically by the same citywide sensor network Verrow used to track rift activity across every district, Reclamation Zones included, whether any one official actually looked at those readings or not. She looked at this one. Aetherite signature, she said, tapping the readout. Stabilizing, in Zone 6. Someone found my deposit and didn't get themselves killed opening it. She sat back slowly, doing the math on a decades-old survey she'd inherited along with this office, one she'd always assumed would gather dust until someone with actual capital wanted to develop it properly and quietly buy the land first. Instead, a 0-rated steward with a folding table and a rubber stamp had gotten there first and turned it into infrastructure before she'd even finished her coffee. Send Yule's failure report up the chain, she said to her assistant, and pull the original zoning file on Reclamation Zone 6. I want to know exactly whose signature put a resource deposit at the bottom of the discard pile, and whether they're going to be a problem when the city's assessment office comes asking the same question I'm about to ask. By the time the sun rose over the Ashfall Yard the next morning, a courier in city colors, not chalk rose, not Draven's, something far more official and, in its own quiet way, far more dangerous, was already walking toward the gate with a sealed notice tucked under one arm. Do-hyun met him there, still smelling faintly of tunnel dust, and read the header on the envelope with a sinking, familiar feeling that had nothing to do with monsters, and everything to do with the one kind of threat his paperwork instincts had never actually been tested against. A bureaucracy bigger than his own. Office of Municipal Assessment. Notice of Formal Inspection. Reclamation Zone 6. He exhaled slowly. Right, he said. Let's see what happens when the city finally decides to read its own paperwork. End of Part 3.